The studio lights blazed hot under the ceiling as the live broadcast rolled on. Two women sat across from each other. Pam Bondi, poised in polished defiance, and Jasmine Crockett, steady as stone, her hands calmly folded atop the debate table. The discussion had started politely enough. A debate on civil rights, justice, and what it meant to belong in America. Cameras panned across the audience, students, scholars, reporters, all leaning forward, absorbing every word. But then it happened. Pam Bondi, her voice sharp and unguarded, leaned in close to the microphone. "You know," she said with a tight smile, "if you have such a problem with America, maybe you should just go back to Africa." For a split second, no one moved. A single gasp escaped from the audience. Then another, until the room trembled under a collective shockwave. The moderator froze, his mouth slightly open. Camera operators glanced at each other, uncertain whether to cut the feed or let it roll. Viewers across the nation sat up straighter, stunned by the words hanging poisonous in the air. I turned toward Jasmine Crockett, but she did not flinch. She did not frown. She did not lower her gaze. Instead, she sat a little taller. And what Jasmine said next, spoken without a tremor, delivered with the weight of generations behind it, would not only silence that room. It would shake every living room, every screen, every heart across America. Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to confrontation, but she had never needed to raise her voice to win a battle. Born in a modest neighborhood in Dallas, Texas, Jasmine had grown up watching her parents march for rights they were told they would never have. Her father, a factory worker, taught her that dignity was not a gift. It was a decision made daily, in the face of everything trying to strip it away. Her mother, a school teacher, used to kneel beside her after tough days at school and whisper, "You belong here, Jasmine." No matter what they say, those words became her armor. By 28, Jasmine had become a public defender, standing in courtrooms where most did not expect her to win, and proving them wrong, again and again. By 35, she had won a congressional seat, against every odd, against every whispered doubt. She never forgot who she was. She never forgot where she came from. And she never forgot that the battles her grandparents fought, marching for the right to sit where they chose, to vote without fear, to live without apology, were not history lessons. They were still happening. They lived in the smiles that disappeared when she entered certain rooms, in the questions she was asked that others were not. Still, Jasmine carried herself with a grace that made mockery look small and hate look foolish. She spoke when it mattered. She listened when others shouted. And when she chose to respond, she did so with the slow, steady certainty of someone whose roots ran deep into soil soaked with both blood and hope. She did not believe in humiliation. She believed in truth. She did not believe in anger for anger's sake. She believed in setting a mirror before injustice and letting it see itself clearly. So when Pam Bondi's words cracked across the room like a whip, Jasmine did not need to shout back. Because every step she had ever taken, every lesson her family had ever passed down, had been preparing her for that moment. A moment not to fight back. A moment to rise. The debate had been advertised for weeks. Two prominent women. Two different Americas. One stage. The organizers promised a respectful conversation about civil rights, history, and the path forward. Viewers tuned in expecting passion, but also professionalism. At first, it seemed possible. Pam Bondi, polished in a sharp navy suit, opened with controlled remarks. Jasmine Crockett answered with quiet conviction, each word measured, her voice calm but unshakable. The early exchanges were tense but civil, until Jasmine began speaking about systemic injustice, about how true patriotism meant fighting to perfect the nation, not pretending it was flawless. Pam's smile grew tighter with every sentence. She interrupted once, then again, cutting Jasmine off mid-thought. At first, Jasmine offered small nods, refusing to match the rising disrespect. But the audience could feel it, the subtle dismissiveness, the way Pam's eyes narrowed when Jasmine cited facts and history, the way she tilted her head slightly, as if barely tolerating the conversation. The moderator tried to pull them back to neutral ground. Pam Bondi, however, had no intention of staying there. With each answer Jasmine gave, clear, reasoned, powerful, Pam's interruptions grew sharper. Snide comments slipped through, dismissive hand waves, small digs framed as jokes. Until the tension was no longer just professional. It became personal, and Jasmine Crockett, seated firmly, hands folded, did not rise to the bait. She did what her father had taught her long ago. When they shout nonsense, you answer with sense. When they show their smallness, you show your roots. But the smallness would not stay small for long. Because when reason could not silence Jasmine, when facts could not beat her strength, Pam Bondi reached for the only weapon left, an insult. One so ugly, so old, so weighted with centuries of cruelty, that the moment it left her mouth, the entire room knew they had crossed a line that could not be stepped back over. And Jasmine Crockett? She was ready, not with rage, not with hate, but with a truth so powerful it would leave not just her opponent, but the entire country speechless. The air in the auditorium shifted. It was subtle at first, an invisible tightening, like the room itself was bracing for impact. Pam Bondi leaned back slightly in her chair after spitting out the words, "Go back to Africa," her expression still smug, almost daring Jasmine to respond with anger. The moderator, visibly stunned, blinked rapidly but said nothing. The audience, students, professors, journalists, ordinary Americans, froze in an uncomfortable half-breath, not knowing if they had heard correctly. Some looked around, waiting for someone, anyone to intervene. Others leaned forward, eyes wide, waiting for the explosion. But none came. Not from Jasmine. She did not raise her voice. She did not slam her hand on the table. She did not deliver the angry tirade that perhaps Pam Bondi had hoped for, one that would reduce Jasmine to the very stereotype she wanted to project. Instead, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, a silence far more powerful than 1,000 shouted words wrapped around her like armor. Her chest rose and fell once, slowly. She glanced toward the moderator, whose throat bobbed nervously, but he offered no words, no apology, no redirection. Jasmine understood in that moment. This battle was hers to finish. In the back rows, people shifted uncomfortably. A woman in the second row, an elderly black teacher, clutched her purse tighter, tears already brimming in her eyes. A young man filming on his phone whispered, "This is history." And it was, because Jasmine Crockett had been handed a moment soaked in centuries of cruelty. And she had the choice, lash out in rage and feed the fire, or rise above it, and in doing so, burn the hatred down to ashes with dignity. She chose the latter. Jasmine took the microphone with both hands, steadied herself, and began to speak. But she did not start with Pam Bondi. She started with herself, her history, her bloodline, her right, not to exist here in apology, but in absolute, unshakable pride. And as she opened her mouth, calm, deliberate, and devastating, the room leaned forward as one, because everyone sensed it. The insult had been thrown like a stone. But Jasmine Crockett was about to return it, not as a weapon, but as a crown. Jasmine Crockett raised the microphone, her hands steady, her eyes locked, not on Pam Bondi, but on the sea of silent faces staring back at her. And she spoke, but not with anger, with history, with roots, with a voice stronger than any insult could reach. "My family did not come here by choice," she said, her voice even and clear. "We were brought here in chains." She paused. "My great-great-grandfather survived the Middle Passage. He survived the plantations. He survived being called less than human." Another pause, perfectly timed. "My grandfather fought in World War II for a country that refused to let him sit at the front of a bus when he came home wearing his uniform." The audience was silent. Every breath seemed caught in their throats. "My father worked double shifts in a factory so that I could study law. My mother, who was told she was too dark to teach, spent 30 years changing lives in classrooms that others had abandoned." Jasmine's voice grew stronger, not louder. And through all of that, not once, did any of them think about leaving this country. She leaned slightly toward the microphone. They thought about changing it. Murmurs ran through the audience, whispers of awe, of grief, of realization. Jasmine looked Pam Bondi straight in the eyes, but her tone never wavered. "I stand on land my ancestors built. I fight for rights they were denied. I walk roads paved by their pain. And when I speak here, I speak with their voices behind mine." She paused again, letting the weight of her words fill the room. "I do not need to go back to Africa." Her voice dropped just slightly, the kind of drop that signals finality. "I belong right here." The auditorium shook, not with sound, but with the kind of collective breath people take when they realize they have witnessed something they will never forget. Pam Bondi sat frozen, her smile gone, her hands limp in her lap. There was no comeback, no defense, Because Jasmine had done something almost no one expected. She had answered hate not with hate, but with heritage. She had turned insult into inheritance. And in doing so, she did not just defeat Pam Bondi. She redefined the conversation for everyone watching live and across America. The auditorium remained silent, as if afraid that even breathing too loudly might shatter the weight of the moment. But Jasmine was not finished. She lowered the microphone slightly, her voice softening not from weakness, but from the unbearable truth she was about to share. "You know," she said, "I learned early that some people would see the color of my skin and decide everything else about me before I ever opened my mouth." She shifted her gaze, sweeping it across the room, not just speaking to Pam Bondi anymore, but to everyone who had ever questioned her right to belong. "I remember being 12 years old," Jasmine continued, her voice threading memories and pain together. "I stood in the cafeteria line at school, just a little girl with big dreams. I had my tray in hand. And a woman behind the counter, she skipped me. She served every child around me." She paused, the memory clearly still raw. "When I finally spoke up," she said, "you can wait. People like you always have to wait." A low murmur rumbled through the crowd. "I went home crying that day," Jasmine said, blinking once, gathering herself. "And my father sat me down at our rickety kitchen table. He took my hands, those same hands I use today to hold microphones, to write laws, and he said, 'They will try to tell you where you do not belong, but your roots are deeper than their hate.'" Her voice tightened with emotion, but she did not let it break. "He told me my blood carried survivors, fighters, dreamers, builders, and that no one, no comment, no insult, no slight, could uproot what had already been planted long before I was born." A hush fell heavier over the room. She smiled then, a small, bittersweet smile. "So when someone like Pam Bondi tells me to go back to Africa, she is not just talking to me. She is talking to every ancestor who refused to be erased. Every American who bled for a freedom they were not allowed to touch." Jasmine stepped back, letting the words settle. "My America is not perfect, but it is mine, and I am not going anywhere." The audience was no longer still because of shock. They were still because they were overwhelmed by truth, by history, by a story that was not just Jasmine's, but ours. Pam Bondi remained frozen, staring straight ahead, as if realizing, too late, that she had tried to diminish a woman whose very existence had been built on battles like this. And now, no one in that room, or watching at home, would ever see Jasmine Crockett the same way again. She was no longer just a participant in a debate. She had become a voice for every soul ever told they did not belong. The silence after Jasmine's words was not empty. It was sacred. It was the kind of silence that falls when people are too moved, too shattered, too awed to even remember to applaud. And then, almost hesitantly at first, it began. A slow, rising sound. One hand clapping from the back, then another, then a third, until the entire auditorium was on its feet, erupting into thunderous applause. Students pounded their hands together, some with tears running down their cheeks. Professors nodded solemnly, as if witnessing not just a powerful speech, but a historic reckoning. The camera panned across the crowd, hands lifted, people weeping, strangers hugging each other. And then cut back to Jasmine Crockett, standing alone at the center of the storm she had created. But she was not shaken. She stood firm, not basking in the applause, but carrying the quiet strength of someone who had always known her worth, even when others tried to deny it. Pam Bondi remained seated, stiff as stone, her face tight and drained of color. No clever words could fix what had been exposed. No apology, no spin, no after-show commentary would undo what the world had just seen. Because this was bigger than one insult. It was bigger than two women on a stage. This was about every time a voice had been mocked, every time a dream had been dismissed, every time someone had been told, "Go back," to a country they had never left because their very bones had built the one they lived in. In the hours that followed, Jasmine's words exploded across social media. Clips of her standing tall, speaking calmly, cutting through centuries of hate with a single line. "My America is not perfect, but it is mine," went viral within minutes. Civil rights leaders, celebrities, athletes, historians all began posting tributes. Talk shows interrupted their regular programming to air the clip. Editorials titled, "The Night America Saw True Grace in Action," began flooding news sites. And what about Pam Bondi? She tried, later to explain, to soften, to spin. But there was no spinning this, because millions had heard Jasmine Crockett's voice. And more importantly, they had felt it. In their hearts, in their histories, and in the undeniable truth that some battles are not fought with fists. They are fought with roots deeper than hate. And in that moment, Jasmine had won something greater than a debate. She had won the soul of the room. Pam Bondi did not leave the stage immediately after the debate ended. She remained seated for a few awkward moments, fiddling with her bracelet, her eyes darting nervously toward the cameras that were still rolling. She could feel it, the shifting tide, the cold distance from the very audience she once believed would applaud her. An aide hurried over, whispering in her ear, suggesting she leave quickly before the crowd could turn even more hostile. She nodded stiffly and gathered her papers with trembling hands. The walk from her chair to the backstage door, which had always been lined with handshakes and smiles in the past, was now lined with silence. Some people turned their backs as she passed. Others simply looked away, their faces tight with disgust or disappointment. Pam had underestimated something essential that night. She thought power came from provocation. But Jasmine Crockett had shown that true power came from poise. In the hours that followed, Pam's team tried to clean up the mess. They issued a statement claiming her words were taken out of context. They said it was an emotional moment, misunderstood by viewers. But the video was everywhere. Clipped, shared, analyzed frame by frame. There was no misunderstanding. The world had heard exactly what she said. And more importantly, they had seen how she said it. Sponsors began to pull back. Political allies remained silent, unwilling to defend the indefensible. A major speaking engagement she was scheduled to headline was quietly canceled the next morning, with the organization citing a commitment to dignity and inclusion. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett said nothing more about Pam Bondi. She did not need to, because dignity had already spoken for her. Instead, Jasmine spent the next morning at a local school, speaking to children about leadership, perseverance, and self-worth. Photos of her reading books to second graders, her smile wide and genuine, began trending under hashtags like #LeadWithGrace and #OurVoiceMatters. Pam Bondi, trapped under the weight of her own words, found herself isolated, not because she had lost a debate, but because she had revealed a truth about herself that no apology could erase. And in the background of all of this, Jasmine Crockett kept moving forward, not fueled by anger, but lifted by 1,000 unseen hands. Hands belonging to those who had once been told to leave, but stayed anyway. Hands that now carried her higher than any stage could ever reach. By the following morning, Jasmine Crockett's name was everywhere. Not just in headlines. Not just trending on social media. Everywhere. Cable news shows ran split-screen coverage. On one side, the clip of Pam Bondi delivering her hateful comment. On the other side, Jasmine Crockett, standing tall, answering with history and undeniable truth. Editorials flooded every major outlet. CNN called it the 5 minutes that redefined dignity in American politics. The Washington Post ran a full-page feature titled, "The Night Jasmine Crockett Spoke for Millions." Even commentators who rarely agreed on anything found common ground in praising her composure, her eloquence, and her power. Oprah tweeted, "Strength is not shouting. It is standing steady when history tries to erase you." Jasmine Crockett showed the world what real leadership looks like. Celebrities, activists, veterans, teachers, people from every walk of life posted their stories of being told they did not belong, and how Jasmine's calm strength reminded them that they always had. Hashtags surged. #We belong here. #Crockett claps back. #roots deeper than hate. #Voice of America across the country. Classrooms played Jasmine's speech for students. Churches quoted her in sermons. Community centers held open discussions about dignity, belonging, and the weight of words. It was no longer just about a racist insult hurled during a debate. It was about what Jasmine had proven without screaming, without stomping, without hate. That heritage cannot be erased by hatred. That pride cannot be uprooted by ignorance. And that true strength, the kind that lasts generations, is forged not in shouting matches, but in moments of silent, immovable dignity. At a rally organized within 48 hours, thousands gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial, many carrying signs that read, "I belong here." Jasmine Crockett was invited as a guest of honor. When she approached the podium, the crowd did not cheer wildly. Instead, they stood in absolute silence, offering the same kind of respect she had commanded during that fateful night. When she finally spoke, she said only one sentence before the crowd erupted. "Tonight, we stand, not as guests, but as heirs of this land's promise." And in that moment, her voice was no longer just hers. It became the voice of millions who had been waiting for someone like her to rise. And rise she did, higher than anyone watching that night could have imagined. Pam Bondi tried to weather the storm. At first, she issued a carefully worded apology on social media. It read more like a legal disclaimer than a heartfelt admission. "I regret that my words were taken out of context. I have always respected passionate debate." But no one was buying it. Not anymore. Major networks that once featured her regularly began canceling appearances. Speaking engagements quietly disappeared. Endorsements she once counted on evaporated overnight. The same conservative circles that had once cheered her for being bold now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the shame her comment had brought down. She attempted a public interview to explain herself, an awkward, hollow affair where she insisted she misspoke and meant no harm. But viewers had seen the truth with their own eyes. The world had already moved on from her. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett was moving forward at lightning speed. Universities called, asking her to deliver commencement speeches. Nonprofits dedicated to civil rights and education extended invitations for her to join their boards. Her office received thousands of letters, handwritten ones, from people across America thanking her for standing strong, for reminding them they were not invisible. But Jasmine did not use the moment to enrich herself. Instead, she founded the Belonging Project, a national initiative aimed at providing scholarships and leadership training for students from marginalized backgrounds who were often told they did not fit. The mission was simple. No child should ever be made to feel they are a visitor in their own country. Her team announced that the first scholarship would be awarded in honor of her father, the man who first told her that her roots ran deeper than hatred could ever reach. As for Pam Bondi, she faded quietly from the spotlight. No scandalous downfall, no screaming headlines, just silence, which, in its own way, was the truest justice of all. Because the real story, the one that mattered, was no longer about an insult. It was about a woman who turned an attack into a platform, a weapon into a movement, a moment of hate into a lifetime of hope. And as Jasmine Crockett stood under the bright lights of a rising future, she knew something her ancestors had always known. The soil they had tilled in chains would one day grow dreams that no one could uproot. The evening air was cool and gentle as Jasmine Crockett walked through the gates of the old cemetery on the edge of town. In her hand, she carried a small framed photograph, the viral moment that had changed her life. Not the insult, not the argument, but the image of her standing tall, unwavering, as the world watched and listened. She found the grave easily. It was a simple stone, worn by time but strong enough to endure decades of weather and memory. Her father's grave. She knelt down slowly, careful not to disturb the silence around her, and placed the frame against the headstone. "I did it, Daddy," she whispered, her voice cracking but steady. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. She let it fall, because some tears were not signs of weakness. They were signs of arrival. Jasmine sat there for a long time, speaking softly about the journey she had taken, about how she had carried his lessons into the world, about how, in the face of hate, she had answered with history, with roots, with a strength too deep for ignorance to pull out. Behind her, the sky began to darken, painted with strokes of purple and gold. And as she stood to leave, she noticed something resting against another nearby grave. A small flag, tattered but still standing. It reminded her that belonging was not something granted by angry words or revoked by cruelty. It was something built, earned, fought for, protected, and passed down. As she walked back to her car, Jasmine did not carry the weight of the insult with her. She carried the weight of legacy, the strength of knowing that she had stood when standing was hardest. And because of that stand, somewhere, a young girl watching her on TV that night now knew she belonged. Without apology, without shame, without permission, she belonged. And that, in the end, was more powerful than any insult ever spoken. There will always be voices that try to tell you that you do not belong. There will always be people who mistake your kindness for weakness, your silence for ignorance, your pride for arrogance. But Jasmine Crockett's story reminds us of something deeper, something stronger. You belong where your dreams take root. You belong where your ancestors bled to build a better future. You belong wherever your heart dares to stand tall. And no insult, no matter how loud, how cruel, how carefully aimed, can ever uproot the truth written in your bones. This land was not built only by the privileged. It was built by hands that were whipped, voices that were silenced, dreams that were buried and dug back up by generations who refused to leave. So when someone tries to shrink you with their ignorance, remember, you are not a guest here. You are not a mistake. You are not someone who needs to apologize for existing. You are the continuation of a fight far older than their hatred and far stronger than their fear. You belong here. Your voice? It matters more than you know. If Jasmine Crockett's courage touched your heart, show your support. Comment below, I belong here. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth. And do not forget to subscribe for more real stories that heal, inspire, and ignite change.